Okay. Okay, would you roll in a 270 from the smoke, approximately 100 meters away from it. I'll adjust you from there.
Only a tree or bush could hide an enemy ready to annihilate them. Ambushes were the order of the day, and they always ended in a shower of blood for both sides. In this new installment of military history, we're going to reconstruct in great detail 3 important offensives carried out by the Vietcong. A series of surprise attacks in which the powerful United States Army was totally humiliated by local guerrillas. Put on your bulletproof vest, grab your M16, and let's get started. Although the official activities of the United States Army in Vietnam began a few years later, a Special Operations Commando Group was established in the Southeast Asian nation in 1964. This was the MACV-SOG, a unit composed of elements of the Navy SEALs, Marines, and members of Special Forces. During its 8 years of activity between 1964 and 1972, MACV-SOG carried out high-risk missions that, despite their importance, were not reported to the general public. In order to operate and keep its structure secret, the group was divided into 3 geographically delimited subcommands: the Northern Command and Control, or CCN, the Central Command and Control, or CCC, and the namesake Southern Command, also called CCS. It was at one of the most important bases in the northern section that the Vietcong carried out one of the most brutal attacks on the Western invader, in a day that will remain forever in the memories of those who survived. Next, we will listen to the memoirs of John Stryker Meyer, one of the most recognized veterans of the legendary MACV-SOG.
During that attack, it came after midnight. It was a moonless night, and the sappers, who were highly trained NBA soldiers, hit the base.
FOB 4, or Forward Operations Base, was a top-secret operational headquarters of enormous importance to Washington. Its role was fundamental for the organization of missions in one of the most conflictive areas of Vietnam, which is why Green Berets and other top-level commandos who cooperated with MACV-SOG were often housed there. The problem was that the flow of activities was very high, and the base was not always guarded with the same solidity. There were brief windows in which FOB 4 was susceptible to a massive attack, and the Vietnamese knew it. For this offensive, the Communist Front employed the infamous sappers, its special forces soldiers trained to give their lives no matter the conditions. During the war, their reputation was cemented through brutal sacrifices. The sappers were fanatical communists willing to do anything, recapturing the fighting spirit of the old kamikazes of Imperial Japan. Such was their determination for their land that they wore a white bandana on their forehead with the words, "We came here to die," written in blood. On the morning of August 23, 1968, a Viet Cong battalion made up of sappers and regular soldiers entered FOB 4. Their strategy had been considered down to the last detail, so much so that the offensive coincided with the night when the new lunar cycle began. This ensured total darkness for them to move like hunters throughout the Vietnamese jungle. News of the attack spread little by little, as shots and explosions echoed in every corner of the territory. Let's listen to veteran Gene Pugh tell what it was like to cross the camp in the middle of a hail of enemy gunfire.
And I hear is bang, bang. Got you, son of a bitch. And then the next breath, I'm hit, I'm hit, I'm hit. So I go out and start dragging him into the barracks, and I could feel the bullets going by my bare torso and snapping right next to my ear. It's an experience that you just wish that they could hit you instead of feeling it that way.
The Spike Team Rattler reconnaissance team was stationed at the top of the Marble Mountains, one of the highest places in Da Nang. The Vietcong commandos were enjoying a peaceful night when suddenly a series of rumblings turned the moment into a nightmare. Below, several meters from their positions, the Vietcong battalion had penetrated the scarce defenses, starting a real massacre. Within minutes, FOB 4 was transformed into a bonfire filled with US corpses. Only a few structures survived the offensive. While the members of the aforementioned Spike Team Rattler reconnaissance team observed all the horror from above, a part of the Vietnamese squad was preparing to ambush them. The sappers used ropes to climb in a few minutes, taking their victims completely by surprise. By the time the climbing team managed to surround Spike Team Rattler, the situation at the entire FOB 4 base had become a true hell on earth. There were tents on fire, lifeless bodies on the ground, and blood mixed with mud and vegetation. In this chaos, North Vietnamese troops ran carrying assault rifles. In one of the most shocking situations, a group of sappers with explosives attached to their bodies ran into the base's ammunition depot. Within seconds, an explosion ended their lives in the weapons reserve of FOB 4. Imagine seeing with your own eyes how a completely deranged enemy soldier runs towards an explosives depot, sacrificing his life to leave you without weapons. This type of kamikaze attack ended up becoming something characteristic during North Vietnamese ambushes. The sappers entered with dynamite or bombs on their bodies to destroy US bunkers and strategic positions. As the first rays of the sun illuminated the base, the Vietcong troops retreated, leaving only devastation behind. Among the ruins of what had been an important American military post, the bodies of 17 Green Berets were found, as well as dozens of wounded, some seriously. Due to the top-secret nature of their work, the eliminated Americans did not have an official funeral service in Southeast Asia. The next ambush we will discuss was not carried out against elite units, but against Marines operating on the banks of the Ong Thon River on the morning of October 17, 1967. During the first months of 1967, the Vietnamese front suffered the loss of thousands of soldiers as a result of the so-called search and destroy missions carried out by the United States Army. But General Tran Van Tra suggested that the communist troops could still achieve victory if they managed to inflict heavy losses on the Americans. That is why, in mid-1967, the 7th and 9th Divisions of the North Vietnamese Army began to plan what would be one of their most brutal and effective offensives. The Ong Thun River runs through a forested region with lots of vegetation, making it an ideal place to hide. With that in mind, on October 16, 1967, a patrol of soldiers from Alpha Company was sent to survey the region. During their mission, they encountered a small enemy unit, which escaped after a brief firefight. Upon reporting this encounter, Uncle Sam's men received a specific order. They were to find this group of Vietnamese and annihilate them. Part of the plan was for them to advance through occupied territory. Upon finding Vietcong settlements, they were to contact the artillery batteries waiting a few miles away. The problem was that the local warriors had already noticed the plan and were waiting for the right moment to attack, like a predator watching its prey. One of the American soldiers did not have a good feeling about the operation.
Well, they told us we were going to a place that was going to be pretty rough, and that's all. They didn't tell us what was waiting on us. You had no choice, you just went.
At around 10 a.m. on October 17, 1967, American soldiers encountered Vietcong troops. As we anticipated, the Asians were waiting in bunkers scattered in strategic areas of the jungle, surrounding the path along which their rival was advancing. When the Americans came within range, chaos broke out. A storm of rifle cartridges, machine guns, and grenades erupted in a deadly ambush. Washington's troops had no time to take up defensive positions and suffered massive losses of personnel during the first minutes of combat. Vietcong men came from all sides, taking advantage of their bunkers and the geography they knew so well. As the North Vietnamese fire increased, the American soldiers thought they heard the distinctive sound of an M60 machine gun. The men assumed it was cavalry that had come to rescue them, so they ceased fire for fear of hitting one of their own. The Asian front took full advantage of this moment of weakness. At about 11:30 a.m., they sent in reserves of Vietnamese personnel who were waiting for the right moment to act. To make matters worse for the Americans, it was impossible to use artillery, as the proximity of their own to their enemies made it too risky.
Alpha Company disappeared. And now the firing was directed against us, against Delta Company.
Lúc đó thì trung đoàn mới tung cái tiểu đoàn 2 là tiểu đoàn dự bị trong ngày, đánh từ sườn bên phải đánh sang đội hình của địch.
At the same time as this part of the offensive, another group of Asian troops had advanced stealthily to the vicinity of the artillery. When the time came, they pounced on the enemy, further complicating the support that the rest of the Americans ambushed in the Ong Thon region could receive. The members of that artillery battalion remember how chaotic that situation was. On the one hand, they had to coordinate the shots and receive information from the soldiers who were further ahead. On the other, they had to defend themselves from the waves of Vietnamese who tried to take over the position. What better way to listen to North Vietnamese Colonel Vo Minh Triet describing the strategy used by his men.
Cái anh tiểu đoàn cũng có cái đài quan sát của anh, rồi anh trung đoàn có cái đài quan sát của anh, tức là những cái đài leo lên trên cao. Các cái bộ đàm này có trực đầy đủ không mới gọi. Cứ để cho đổ xuống sườn, khi kéo vào đến một cái tầm là nổ súng rồi.
One of the artillery observers, that is, those men in charge of surveying the landscape and translating it into concrete data for launching attacks, was Lieutenant Harold Pinky Durham. He was an experienced soldier who was on his second tour in Vietnam. He adopted a dangerous position, exposing himself to hostile fire coming from several directions, but it was necessary so that he could communicate with the rest of the troops and coordinate the artillery attacks. Durham calmly and quietly carried out his work, providing precise coordinates that managed to blow up several Vietnamese positions. Unfortunately, during combat, the brave soldier stepped on a Claymore-type mine, which does not explode, but does launch hundreds of metal pieces that pierce the victim's body. Durham suffered very serious injuries, and due to that incident, he was left blind in one of his eyes. With his vision flooded with blood and his body lacerated, the lieutenant continued to operate effectively, providing coordinates by radio even when the bullets grazed his head. Thanks to this man's sacrifice, North Vietnamese forces were unable to complete their massacre as they could no longer advance on the soldiers who had been ambushed further ahead. On that fateful day in October, Durham saved hundreds of lives. Listen to the description of Captain Carl Kaiser, who was part of the engagement and survived to reconstruct the initial events.
And one of the members of the flank security reported hearing movement and hearing a metallic click on his right flank. At that time, a machine gun opened fire on the right file of the 1st Platoon of Alpha Company.
That's the first shots that were heard.
That's correct.
As the American troops managed to organize and regain ground, the Vietcong soldiers began to retreat. The bulk of the Asian column ceased hostilities and left the area about 2 hours after the hell began. They could return home satisfied, having more than fulfilled their mission, as they managed to inflict brutal damage on the American ranks. In total, Ong Than's offensive claimed the lives of 56 Washington soldiers. Another 75 were wounded, and 2 remain missing to this day. Among the dead was the heroic Harold Durham, who received the legendary Medal of Honor posthumously for his dedication and sacrifice to ensure the survival of his comrades. The Vietnam War was brutal, but it is precisely in these extreme conditions that heroism and military ability flourish. That is why the last ambush that we will review in this video also has a recipient of the legendary Medal of Honor as a participant. Let's put ourselves in time and space. On August 25, 1968, members of the American 48th Transport Group were carrying out their important job, transporting supplies to prevent soldiers from starving to death. On that day, the convoy was particularly large, with a total of 81 trucks that left the town of Long Binh loaded with food, fuel, and weapons. As you can imagine, the roads that connected Vietnam at that time were not exactly gems of modern engineering. Quite the opposite. They were winding and precarious roads that linked the starting point to Saigon, the final destination of the 48th Transport Group. Around noon, the convoy entered the village of Ap Nai, a small rubber tree plantation that stretched along the only passable road. There was a column of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, the southern front that allied itself with the United States. Their presence was something to be expected, since these troops collaborated with the pacification of communities like the one they were passing through. Within a few minutes, the convoy already occupied the entire extension of the village. When the first trucks began to leave Ap Nai, the presumed soldiers, friends of Uncle Sam, revealed their true identity. They were Viet Cong men, armed to the teeth to rid the drivers and elements of the 48th Transport Group. Not only did they have surprise on their side, but the Asians had posted snipers on both sides of the road, placing all the American vehicles in the deadly zone. the most vulnerable part in an ambush. The Battle of Apni was not limited to gunfire. The communist soldiers also used machine guns and RPG-7 launchers to destroy the vehicles. The primary objective was to cut off the supply of provisions and, if possible, capture some of the loot to feed the Vietcong with weapons and food. After spraying the trucks carrying food with bullets, the attackers' fury focused on the fuel tankers, waiting for them to explode and completely block the convoy's advance. In this part of the story, we will meet the great hero who emerged in the midst of this chaos. William Say was a truck driver of only 19 years old. Thanks to his skills behind the wheel, he became a member of the transport company, but that did not mean he did not know how to fight. When the shooting broke out in Apni, the boy jumped out of his vehicle and looked for the rest of his companions to organize the response. In an ambush, it is essential to stay calm and act by listening to your head, not the fear roaring in your stomach. Say and other drivers positioned themselves 6 meters away from each other, adopting a defensive position to repel the first attack of the Vietnamese soldiers. The boy opened fire and killed 2 enemies who were about 10 meters away. Meanwhile, one of his companions managed to eliminate a Vietcong soldier, but then his M16 jammed and was unusable. However, the death of the 3 communists scared away a small group of guerrillas who were approaching the trucks. William C. played a prominent role in protecting his comrades at Apni. First, he fearlessly threw hand grenades that drove the enemy back. The North Vietnamese assumed there were several men, but it was just Say holding his own. During this time, the boy was shot in the wrist and bled out throughout the day. Still, he managed to drag several wounded comrades to safety under a hail of enemy shells. It is hard to imagine the bravery and resolve it takes to repeatedly expose yourself to painful death to save others. It was for this, as well as for eliminating several Vietcong soldiers, that William received the Medal of Honor. Unfortunately, the 19-year-old ended up dying from multiple wounds that caused massive blood loss. The ambush was incredibly long, with intermittent hostilities that extended over 9 hours of that infamous August 25th. This gave enough time for the U.S. Air Force and artillery to show up, showering the communist guerrillas with fire and destruction. Finally, at 9 p.m., a large infantry unit arrived to assist the rear of the convoy. Seeing themselves outnumbered, the North Vietnamese retreated into the jungle. In total, 30 Americans died, 45 were wounded, and 2 were taken prisoner, making this episode one of the deadliest of the entire conflict. Throughout this installment, it became clear that material or numerical superiority are not always the most powerful cards. Ambushes and surprise attacks can be a deadly tool that balances the scales. The United States learned this the hard way during its intervention in Vietnam. And so we come to the end of the video. If you like this content and want to continue discovering the most incredible events in military history, we invite you to subscribe and activate notifications. Without further ado, we say goodbye until the next installment of Military History. Thank you for joining us.